Welcome to Flip It Furniture. My name is Amy. In today's video, we're going to be making over this French provincial cabinet. I got this from Facebook Marketplace for $20. I believe it used to have a hutch connected to it because there are some brackets in the back, or maybe even a mirror. But I think without it, we're going to be able to give it a really, really awesome makeover. So let's flip it. I start this furniture makeover by cleaning my piece with Dixie Belle's White Lightning Cleaner. I have it pre-made in a spray bottle, so I like to just spray my piece and then wipe it down with a napkin or a rag. After cleaning and removing all the hardware, I then go in with a wet rag with water and I just wipe down my piece so I don't leave any cleaner residue on it. Inside the cabinet, there are two little holes. So I'm just going to go in with my Dixie Belle's mud in white and I'm going to fill in those holes. It's just kind of like a spackle or a wood filler. It works the same exact way. And then I let it dry for a couple hours and go back and then sand it smooth. Now, because the surface of this cabinet is pretty shiny, I need to go in with Dixie Belle's Slick Stick. Slick Stick is really good for like laminated surfaces, anything shiny metal. If you apply 2 coats of this, then your paint will adhere to whatever you're putting it on. If I was to just add my chalk paint without using Slick Stick, more than likely it would chip. You could scratch it and the chalk paint would come up. It just wouldn't stick. So this gives it something really nice for the chalk paint to adhere to. I do 2 coats. After this first coat, I'm going to wait 2 hours and then I go back in and do another coat of Slick Stick and I wait for that to dry overnight. Slick Stick is really easy to apply, but it can be a little tricky because if you leave a lot of brush strokes or texture, then it's exactly what will be underneath your paint when you're applying your paint. So a tip is to sand in between coats of Slick Stick. So this is my Slick Stick dry and I'm just going to go through with my 180 grit sanding paper and just sand it smooth and knock off some of those brush lines. Now I apply my second coat and I let it dry overnight. And I guess that would mean 8 hours at least, but I ended up leaving it for maybe 12 or 13 hours. Now here we have some raised bubbles and they were noticeable before. I tried to sand them, but sanding them just does nothing. Now I just take my razor blade and I carve out around all the little bubbles and I make just a little hole. By making a hole, I'm pretty much getting rid of any damaged particle board that is underneath this paint. It looks like it would be time consuming, but it's really not. This process only takes about 5 minutes and there are so many holes that I had to make. I'm using my Dixie Belle mud and a putty knife and I'm just filling in those holes. I let the Dixie Belle mud dry for not very long. If you use just a little bit of it, it dries pretty quick, but if you glob it on, it's going to take a lot longer. So I let it dry for about an hour before I start sanding it. Now I'm sanding it smooth with my 120 sanding block. And then I need to go back over and do a coat of Slick Stick. I chose Dixie Belle's Silk line to paint this and I'm using the color Saltwater. Dixie Belle Silk is a 3-in-1. It's a primer, paint, and a top coat all in one. But because my surface was so shiny, I had to add Slick Stick anyway. I just knew that I needed to be on the safe side with that. The mineral paint can be a little bit tricky when you're starting out. You want to go in long brush strokes, and you don't want to overwork it. That's really important, because if you overwork it, it gets really hard to move the paint around, and then it kind of gets a little like there'll be rough brush strokes in there. So you want to go up and down maybe 3 or 4 times and then move on to your next section. Now here, I'll show you kind of what I mean. The middle part, there are no brush strokes. It's nice and smooth. The paint, it's supposed to be self-leveling, and that's exactly what it did. But up top, I do have some brush strokes. So I'm just gonna take my 180 sanding pad, knock off those brush strokes. I did the top, and I did get a ton of brush strokes for the top. I've used the silk before, and sometimes I'll get brush strokes and sometimes I get a really smooth finish. I guess it just depends on how I lay the paint down. So if you do get some brush strokes, I just wanted to show you really quick. I took it outside and I'm using my 180 grit sanding paper, and I'm just moving the sander. I'm not putting any pressure on it at all. I'm just letting it do the work by itself. If you put pressure on it and put your hands down, you'll remove your paint. But if you just let it glide on its own, it'll make it such a smooth surface if that's the look you're going for. Now I'm using Dixie Belle's decoupage paper in Spring Flowers, and this whole entire piece was inspired by this paper. I love the wrapping paper for this decoupage. I don't know, it was the white with the flowers and then that really pinkish purple color. So that has completely inspired what I'm going to do with this piece. I lined my paper up where I wanted it to go, sort of in the frame of this cabinet, and then I'm using my fingers to make an imprint on the paper. I think the paper is rice paper, so it's really, really thin, but not thin enough to where it's gonna rip. So I'm just making an imprint of where I want to cut so that I can trace with my scissors exactly where it's gonna go. And then I just cut right along that line that I made with my fingernails. Now I'm going to paint on exactly where I want it to go. I'm going to paint on Dixie Belle's clear coat in satin, and that's going to be my glue for the decoupage paper. And this is where the tricky part begins. Now we need to just line up our paper where we want to put it, and then we want to get it nice and smooth. So I'm just going to take my time and use my hands and my fingers to smooth it out on there. Now my paper is on, there's no bubbles or wrinkles or lines, and I'm just going to use my clear coat again, and I'm going to clear coat straight over it. Now another quick tip. There is a line where my paper ends and the cabinet begins, and they are two different colors. So I'm going to go in with my Dixie Belle mud and just sort of mud in those lines. It's all dry, so now I'm just going to sand it smooth. You can still see it a little bit, but not like before. I'm adding my paint down into the flowers and sort of blending so it looks like a nice smooth blend. Now I want to add a little something to the side, so I'm going with the silkscreen stencils in roses. There is literally a screen in the white part, and I didn't notice that until I started washing them out. There's a little screen, so that's why they come up so beautiful. You don't have to cut your stencil, I'm just doing it because it's going to make it a lot easier for me. I want to put them in the corners, so cutting it out just makes sense. And like I said, I love the bells and whistles packaging, so I'm going to try to match that color that's on the stencil. And I already have a 50-50 mixture of Plum Crazy and Aubergine. So I'm just going to add a little bit more of Plum Crazy to my 50-50 mixture, which I think in the end probably makes it 3 parts Plum Crazy and 1 part Aubergine. I'm going to call that pretty close. There's a backing paper on the stencil, and that's just to make sure that we keep it clean. So I'm going to take the backing paper off and stick my stencil straight on my dresser. You just want to rub it on and make sure that there's no air bubbles or anything like that, because your paint will get underneath, but it's pretty easy. It's just like putting a sticker on. Now I use a little craft brush and I add my paint. You just want to be extra careful when you're near the edges, not to get your paint over the edge. So using a Lastly, you just peel the stencil off carefully and it comes up pretty clean. Now I want to do something with the details, so I'm going to use the Dixie Belle mousse in diamond. It's a silver, it's just a really pretty silver color. I'm also using a craft brush for this because you can make a real mess, so you have to be kind of careful. And if you do make a mess, it's okay because it's water-based. You can just get a little wet rag or a wet paper towel and wipe it off. Then I just finished the inside of the cabinet with my salt water, and I didn't have to prime it because it's regular wood, it's not shiny or anything. And I add a total of 2 coats to the inside. I decided I needed a little bit of extra protection on the top, so I am going to do 2 coats of Dixie Belle's clear coat in satin. And I'm using the gator hide sponge because it is super awesome. It just makes putting on a top coat really, really easy. And here it is all finished. And I added a little glass knob that I had left over from another project. The inside looks nice and clean. The top is very smooth. And my stencils give it just a nice little extra pop on the sides. Overall, I'm really happy with this makeover. I think it turned out to be a really sweet piece. If you enjoyed this makeover, please hit the like and subscribe button, and I will see you next week.